Hosanna!
Hosanna!
Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. We welcome all of you today to Palm Sunday service as we worship the Lord on this special day and as we begin what is the journey of Holy Week and leads us next week to Resurrection Sunday. I see a number of guests. We're thrilled that you've come and chosen to worship with us today, and we hope that you will find one of the visitor cards in the back of the pew in front of you and put it into the offering plate after you fill it out. It would be wonderful. We're so glad, most of all, that you're here. It's been a big day. We had a big breakfast today, and we have some special things going on during the service that you may be able to see in the bulletin. So God has great things in store. And after the program, the chairman of this organization offered him a check. "Oh, I couldn't take that," said the pastor with some embarrassment. "I just appreciate the honor to be able to speak. If you have better uses for the money, apply it to one of those uses." And the program chairman then asked, "Well, do you mind if we put it into our special fund?" And the pastor said, "Of course not. What is your special fund for?" And the chairman answered, "It's so we can get a better speaker next year." Life is full of humbling experiences. And a humbler man never lived than Jesus of Nazareth. That's the essence of the good news today. For on one hand, we see that no greater man ever lived than Jesus. He was the very Word of God come down from the Father. He was the life and the light and the truth and the way. And yet, no one emptied himself more completely of pride and arrogance than did Jesus Christ. Consider the donkey, the whole donkey thing. This donkey he rode into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. We would have chosen a handsome stallion to ride in on. I mean, after all, we're careful about the kind of car we drive, aren't we? The world will not respect an old beat-up Chevy like it respects a new BMW or Mercedes. At least that's what we're taught. It's almost like Jesus picked up a battered 1957 Studebaker to drive into Jerusalem. That's how I imagine the donkey looked. Certainly this humble beast was not a symbol of pride and prestige. Now, Jesus' entry into the holy city was consistent with everything he lived and taught. Remember how offended Simon Peter was when Jesus offered to wash his feet? That was a servant's job. That's not something a distinguished rabbi would ever be doing. The idea that greatness was related to servanthood was a principle that Jesus' disciples had difficulty grasping. Now, the washing of the feet of the disciples took place the night of the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper. And Luke tells us that on the way to that sacred meal, the disciples were arguing over who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom of Jesus. See, the disciples were thinking of greatness in terms of worldly success. To achieve success was to have others serve you. So they really weren't prepared just minutes later to handle Jesus' teaching that whoever wants to be the first must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life a ransom for many. That was radical teaching for them. It's radical teaching for us today. And yet, there's an important truth here for our lives. Palm Sunday is the beginning of Holy Week. It's interesting to watch the strong Son of God acknowledging his dependence on God the Father during those final hours. It's in the garden that Jesus prays, "If it be possible, Father, let this cup pass from me." On the cross, at the height of his despair, he cries out, "My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" You and I have prayed that kind of prayer, even though we might even know that God has not forsaken us. And then at the end, he prayed, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Folks, if Jesus found it necessary to utterly and completely depend upon God, then how can you and I possibly live our lives without doing the same? Read recently that when somebody's given a pen, 97% of the people who test it out do it by writing their name. Sounds a bit self-centered to me. Well, it's very difficult for some of us to get beyond our circumstances, our situations, our own needs. It is so essential this morning, on Palm Sunday, that we see this humble Galilean riding into Jerusalem on that donkey. His concern is for our welfare, not his own. The Nicene Creed affirms that Jesus was very God of very God. Yet here he was, humbling himself, to be sacrificed like a farm animal on the cross of Calvary. Indeed, he is referred to in Revelations as the Lamb who was slain. No crown, no thorn, no comfortable palace. He gave it all up for you, for me. This has always endeared Jesus to all levels of society. And I believe that gives Jesus the ability to actually be great. This is where his greatness comes from. Do you have that much greatness within you? Do I? To put ourselves aside and see to the needs of the least and the lowly? Or do we risk being one of those petty little people who can only see their own needs? My daughter talks about people with their entitlement issues. I think the real key to greatness is humility. The key to greatness is humility. We don't live in a world that practices that very well. But this is important for us as Christ followers to see. Servanthood, according to Jesus, is the true path to success. And some of the greatest people who have ever lived have viewed themselves as servants, and we've been blessed by them. There's a true story about a 14-year-old Jewish girl at the end of World War II who was discovered lost and alone, barely alive, lying on the platform of an abandoned railroad station. It was the very day that the Russian army had liberated a Nazi concentration camp where she was being held captive. And though she was free, she was half-starved and too exhausted to even pick herself up off the ground. And she figured she would just die there. But then a young priest came beside her. He offered her tea, 2 slices of bread, and a piece of cheese. "Where do you want to go?" he asked. She said, "Krakow." "Well, I'm going there too. Let me help you." And he tried to lift up this little girl named Edith to her feet, but she collapsed. So he picked her up and literally carried her 2 miles to the train that went to Krakow. "What is your name?" he asked. "Edith Desire," she said. "Well, my name is Carol," replied her rescuer. And when they arrived at Krakow, they were separated. They never saw each other again until year 2000. In Jerusalem, at the Holocaust Memorial, Edith Zeiser, with tears in her eyes, clasped the hands of a Polish priest named Karol, who the world had grown to know as Pope John Paul II. This Pope had performed this act of quiet service, of lifting up and carrying that poor Holocaust survivor, and he had completely forgotten about it. But not Edith. Before the whole world, she declared, "He came like an angel out of nowhere and gave me life. He saved me. There's no other word for it. It's thanks to him that I'm here today." And then Edith Zeiser quoted a verse from the Talmud, which says, "To save one life is to save the world." It's so easy to think of the Pope and all the pomp and circumstance that comes with his office. But we forget that many of the modern popes, including maybe the current one, have had a heart of a servant. All greatness grows out of humility and service. There's a wonderful story that comes to us from the Russian Jewish tradition. It's about a rabbi, it's a folk story about a rabbi in a small village who would vanish several hours Friday morning. Nobody knew where he went. And the villagers bragged that their rabbi ascended to heaven and spoke with God on those Friday mornings. A skeptical newcomer had trouble believing that story, that this rabbi ascended on Friday to speak with God. So he was determined to uncover where the rabbi really went during these times. So one Friday morning, this newcomer hid around the rabbi's house and watched him. He saw the rabbi say his prayers and then get dressed as a peasant. And next he saw the rabbi take an axe and go into the forest. And he watched that rabbi chop down a tree and gather a bundle of wood. And next he saw the rabbi proceed to the poorest section of the village where lived an old woman, her sick son. And he watched as the rabbi deposited the wood, which was enough for 1 week, at the woman's door, and then he quietly returned to his home. The story concludes with this newcomer staying in the village, becoming a disciple of the rabbi. And whenever one of the people in the village would say, "Oh, on Friday mornings, our rabbi ascends to heaven," the newcomer would add quietly, "if not higher." Jesus came into Jerusalem riding on a donkey. Now, part of this was to fulfill an ancient prophecy. When Solomon was anointed king, he rode into the city on a donkey to shouts and praises. And Zechariah prophesied that the Messiah, when he came, would do the same thing, ride on a donkey. Jesus knew about this prophecy when he chose a donkey for his ride. But this act was also completely within his character. He humbled himself, writes St. Paul, and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, there were 2 parades that day in Jerusalem. We see Jesus riding on a small donkey, accompanied by his followers, coming from the north into Jerusalem. But that parade wasn't the largest or the most spectacular parade in town on that particular Passover season. Also entering Jerusalem at Passover from the west was the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate. Now, like most Roman governors of Judea before him, Pontius Pilate lived in Caesarea. He spent most of his time at his beach house. But with crowds of devout Jews flowing into Jerusalem for the Passover, Pilate needed to put on a display of force. After all, Passover commemorates the Jews' deliverance from the rule of Pharaoh, and Pilate didn't want them to get any ideas about liberation from Rome. So when Pilate entered Jerusalem, he did so with his army. His aim was to prevent any possibility of violent rebellion against Roman rule. Now, no one likes a foreign power on their necks. And to make matters worse, nobody likes extremely high taxes. So there was always a threat that zealots would stir up the Jewish population to try to throw off the yoke of Rome. The army, the Roman army that accompanied Pontius Pilate, included cavalry on horses and foot soldiers and leather armor and helmets and weapons and banners, golden eagles on poles, sun glittering on metal and gold. There was the sound of marching feet and the creaking of leather and the clinking of bridles and the beating of drums. And all of this would have a sobering effect on all of those who saw the parade. And that was exactly their intention. No one shouted Hosanna when Pilate strode into town on his glorious horse, with a regiment of his most trusted soldiers, hoping to ensure fear on the onlookers. And if things did get out of hand, Pilate had several battalions of Rome's finest on the west side of Jerusalem, just ready to flood into the city at the hint of rebellion. So there was Pilate, willing, without exception, to take the life of anyone who dared question his authority. But there was Jesus, willing, without exception, to lay down his life for the least and the lowest. No contrast could be starker. And we're left to choose. Will we go with Pilate the merciless, who would crush others to gain his own way? Or do we go with Jesus the merciful, who lays down his life for others? It's a choice that we probably end up making more often than we think we do. In the way we treat people, the actions we do, the things we think each and every day. As we go into this special week, I hope that you will choose Jesus. I hope that you will choose him by opening your hearts and by praying, Lord, give me the ability to love others as Christ loves me. Help me to live a life of service as he lived a life of humble service, even though he was the Lord of all creation. And help me to make whatever changes that you would have me take place in my life. that I may also be the man or the woman that's committed to service to others. So the question today is simply this: which parade will you choose?